Jane always believed she had found the love of her life when she met Peter. They got married young, full of dreams and expectations. In the beginning, their relationship was like a fairy tale. Peter was affectionate, attentive, and passionate. They envisioned a bright future together, filled with happiness and companionship. Jane felt like nothing could go wrong. However, as the years went by, that fairy tale began to crumble. Peter started to change, becoming increasingly aggressive and cold. The man Jane knew and loved slowly turned into a stranger. Peter began coming home late, reeking of alcohol, and his fits of rage became more frequent. Sweet words were replaced with cruel insults, and affection turned into indifference. One night, Jane was eagerly awaiting Peter. The table was set, dinner was getting cold, and the clock ticked away the hours. When the door finally opened, Peter stumbled in, clearly intoxicated. Trying to keep her composure, Jane said, "Peter, you're late again. I made dinner. I was waiting for you." Peter, sarcastically laughing, replied, "And who told you I asked you to make dinner, Jane? Do you think I care about that crap?" Jane, tears welling up, said, "I just wanted us to spend more time together, like before." Interrupting angrily, Peter replied, "Like before? You're living in the past, Jane. Wake up. Nothing you do is good enough. You're just a mediocre housewife." Jane felt her heart shatter into a million pieces. The man who once made her feel special now treated her as if she were invisible. Peter staggered to the couch and collapsed onto it, completely ignoring Jane's effort. She looked at the set table, the now cold and untouched dinner, and felt a wave of despair and sadness wash over her. Jane, who once saw marriage as a safe haven, now lived in a true hell. Despite all the signs, she resigned herself to the situation, believing that this was just how life was. They had no children, and Jane focused on taking care of the house and working while Peter went out to drink and gamble with friends. Her routine became a cycle of pain and resignation. On a typical day, as Jane cleaned the house after yet another bitter argument with Peter, the doorbell rang. Upon opening the door, Jane was met by two young people carrying Peter, who was unconscious. The young ones explained that they had found Peter passed out on the street and rushed to help him, fearing he might have had a stroke. Stunned, Jane assisted the young ones in placing Peter on the couch and called an ambulance. While they waited for help to arrive, Jane asked the young ones how they knew Peter. Trembling, looking at the young ones, Jane asked, How do you know my husband?" Eric, nervous but trying to remain firm, replied, "We found him unconscious. He seemed to need help." In shock, almost voiceless, Jane insisted, "You didn't tell me how you know Peter. Who are you?" Jennifer, with tears in her eyes, revealed, "My name is Jennifer, and this is my brother Eric. We are Peter's children." Jane was paralyzed by the revelation. The twins recounted that their mother had been the housemaid at Jane and Peter's house 20 years ago. Jane remembered the girl named Mary, who at the time she worked for them was a younger and friendlier woman. Mary resigned without explaining much of what was happening. Jane, remembering with a trembling voice, said, "Mary, the maid," but she left without explanation. Eric, shaking his head, confirmed, "Yes, our mother. She had to leave because she was pregnant with us." Jane, crumbling, falling to her knees, exclaimed, "My God, all these years, why?" Jennifer, kneeling beside Jane, holding her hand, said, "We're so sorry. We didn't want it to be like this, but he's always been there for us, even if in secret." Jane, looking at Jennifer, tears streaming down her face, asked, "He's been there for you? And for me, he became a stranger. How could he do this?" Jane's shock and pain were immense, but she didn't have much time to process the information because the ambulance arrived and took Peter to the hospital. While Peter was in the hospital, Jane began piecing together the puzzle. Memories of small details that once made no sense were now fitting together painfully. Determined to uncover the whole truth, Jane decided to confront Mary. Jane approached Mary's house, her heart heavy with doubts and anguish. When Mary opened the door and saw Jane, her face turned pale. Trying to control her trembling voice, Jane said, "Mary, we need to talk, now." Mary, visibly nervous, replied, "Of course, Jane. Come in." As soon as they sat down, Jane got straight to the point. With her eyes fixed on Mary, Jane asked, "Is it true? Were you Peter's lover all these years?" Mary, sighing deeply, admitted, "Yes, it's true. I was Peter's lover for 2 decades. He always promised he would leave you to be with me and our children, but he never kept the promise." Feeling the betrayal and humiliation, Jane inquired, "And why did you continue? How could you do this to me?" With teary eyes, Mary replied, "Peter never let us lack anything. He was always a caring father, and I believed in him. I believed that one day he would be with us alone." With tears streaming down her face, Jane said, "You say he was a caring father, but to me he became a stranger. How could he do this? How could you both do this?" Crying, Mary replied, "I didn't want it to be like this, Jane. I never wanted to hurt you." Feeling a mix of anger and sadness, Jane stood up and left Mary's house. She felt betrayed and humiliated, both by her husband and by the former maid. A 30-year marriage, with 20 of them filled with lies and betrayals. Peter, weakened in the hospital, was pale and feeble, his eyes searching for Jane amidst pain and despair. He reached out a trembling hand when he saw her enter the room. "Jane, please forgive me," Peter pleaded, his voice faltering. "I need you. Don't let me die alone." Jane, staring at him, felt a mix of emotions. She observed the man who once was her world, now reduced to a frail and desperate figure. She remembered all the betrayals and humiliations she endured over the years. The pain was palpable, but there was also a hint of compassion in her heart. "Peter, you've destroyed our life together," Jane said, her voice cold. "But I won't abandon you now, not for you, but because I'm not like you." During the days Peter spent hospitalized, Jane was there by his side, witnessing his slow and painful recovery. Each visit was a constant reminder of the lies and pain he caused. His children and lovers didn't show up, limiting themselves to a few phone calls to see if he was still alive. "Why aren't they coming to see me?" Peter asked in a moment of lucidity, tears streaming down his face. "Because, Peter, you pushed them away too," Jane replied with a weary sadness. "You thought you could have it all, but ended up losing everyone." While Peter slept, Jane sat by the bed, reflecting on decades of their marriage. Her constant presence in the hospital was both an act of duty and closure. It was like she was closing a painful chapter of her life, watching the consequences of Peter's choices crumble around him. "You always told me I wasn't good enough," Jane murmured to herself, looking at Peter's worn-out face. "But the truth is, you were never good enough for us." Peter, in a moment of semi-consciousness, grasped Jane's hand with the little strength he had left. "Jane, please, I love you. Don't leave me." Jane, tears welling up in her eyes, squeezed his hand. "I'm here, Peter. I'm here, but things will never be the same." Throughout Peter's time in the hospital, Jane was the only one to visit him, the only one to witness his suffering and slow recovery. The void left by the absence of his children and lover was a cruel reflection of the life he built. For Jane, these days were a testament to her own strength and resilience, a prelude to the uncertain future that awaited her. Jane continued to question and blame herself for the situation she was going through. She felt lost, trying to understand what she had done wrong to deserve so much suffering. She decided she couldn't carry this weight alone anymore and began telling some family members what she had discovered. "I can't believe this, Jane," said her sister Maggie, incredulous. "You deserve so much more than this. You need to get a divorce." "But I always thought my marriage should be forever," Jane replied, her eyes welling up. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." When Peter finally returned home, weakened and fragile, Jane was determined. She knew she needed to make a decision to reclaim her life. Peter, noticing Jane's emotional distance, tried to ask for forgiveness. "Jane, I know I messed up. It was a mistake from the past," Peter said, tears in his eyes. "But I love you. I don't want to get divorced." Jane listened silently, feeling sad and disappointed. Despite Peter's tears, she remained steadfast in her decision. She knew she couldn't continue living a lie. "Peter, you betrayed me for decades. I can't just forget that," Jane replied firmly. "I'm getting a divorce." Determined not to carry this burden alone, Jane called Peter's children, hoping they could help take care of their father. "Eric, Jennifer, I need you to come pick up your father. He's very weak, and I can't take care of him alone," Jane said, hoping for a positive response. "Sorry, Jane," Eric replied coldly. "We don't have time to take care of him. We have our own lives to deal with." Desperate and unsure of what to do, Jane decided to call Mary, Peter's lover, hoping she would take responsibility. "Mary, I'm divorcing Peter. Now you can be together officially," Jane said, trying to stay calm. "Now that he's sick, I don't want to be with him," Mary replied coldly. "That's your responsibility now." Jane was perplexed, feeling even more betrayed and alone. Nobody wants to take care of Peter. What do I do? He's still very weak and needs care, Jane murmured to herself, desperate. Despite feeling disappointed, Jane still cared about Peter's well-being. She asked for help from family and friends, but most of them advised her to get rid of this burden. "Jane, he deserves to die alone after everything he's done to you," said a friend angrily. But Jane couldn't agree with that. She tried to find another solution, turning to a nursing home. However, when she visited the place, she was shocked by the cost. "I can't afford this on my own," Jane said desolately. She tried once again to contact Peter's children, but they received her call with coldness and distance. "Is Dad dead?" Eric asked emotionlessly. "No, he's not dead," Jane replied, trying to control her anger. "I need help to pay for the nursing home." "Sorry, Jane, we can't help," Eric replied, indifferent. Jane understood she was alone in this. In a moment of despair, she shouted at Peter, cried, and vented. She realized she had never retaliated against all the verbal abuse she endured throughout the marriage. "You destroyed me, Peter, all these years, and I never said anything. But now you're going to listen. I'm not that submissive woman anymore," Jane shouted, tears streaming down her face. Seeing she had no other solution, She decided to stay married to him, but made it clear she would no longer tolerate being mistreated. "You're alone, Peter, and you need me, but don't think that means I've forgiven you," Jane said firmly. "You're alone." Peter began exhibiting increasingly strange behavior. He would isolate himself in the room, writing frantically in a diary. Jane, who knew Peter had never had this habit, became deeply alarmed. His paranoid behaviors became more evident with each passing day. He would mutter to himself, sometimes demonstrating delusional behavior. During the night, Jane would hear him whispering and moving restlessly. The intense emotions of recent times seemed to be pushing Peter into a paranoid episode. One night, unable to bear the worry any longer, Jane decided to investigate. While Peter slept, she entered the room and found the diary. As she opened the first page, her heart raced. Peter's words revealed intense fear and growing paranoia. He described Mary's threats, the guilt, and despair over his actions. With horror, Jane read how Mary was blackmailing Peter, threatening to reveal the truth about the twins if he didn't financially support her. The diary was a window into Peter's tortured mind, showing a man on the brink of collapse. With tears in her eyes, Jane closed the diary and left the room. With each step, she felt anger and pain mixed with bitter compassion. She knew that, despite everything, Peter was paying the price for his lies. But that didn't diminish the suffering he had caused her. Days passed, and Peter became more paranoid and desperate. His nights were sleepless, and he could barely communicate with Jane. The tension in the house grew with each passing day, until one night, Peter had a nervous breakdown. In a moment of despair, he attempted to take his own life. Jane found him in time and called emergency services, saving his life. As she waited for the ambulance to arrive, Jane held Peter's hand, feeling a mix of anger and compassion. She couldn't believe he had reached this point, but she also knew that the situation was the result of the choices he had made. When Peter returned from the hospital, even more debilitated, Jane decided she needed to take action. Gathering all the information she had found, she prepared to confront Mary. The revelation of the true reason behind Peter's strange behavior made her determined to put an end to all the manipulation and lies. With a firm voice, Jane confronted Peter. "I know about the blackmail. I know Mary was using you. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Peter, with tears in his eyes, replied, "I was afraid, Jane. Afraid of losing everything. Afraid of you leaving me. I was trapped." Jane shook her head, feeling a mix of pity and anger. "You had already lost everything, Peter. Every lie, every betrayal. You destroyed our life." Peter, sobbing, said, "I know, and now I'm paying for it. I just don't know if I can take it anymore." With her eyes fixed on him, Jane replied, "You will endure, Peter, and I will resolve this, but not for you. For the years I lost, for the woman I was forced to become." She left the room, determined to confront Mary and put an end to this story of lies and blackmail once and for all. Jane arrived at Mary's house with a heavy heart, but determined. When Mary opened the door and saw Jane, an expression of surprise and disdain crossed her face. "We need to talk, Mary," said Jane, her voice firm and cold. Mary, with a sarcastic smile, replied, "About what, Jane? Did you come to complain that your cheating husband is sick?" Jane entered the house without waiting for an invitation, closing the door behind her. "I know everything. I know that you've been blackmailing Peter all these years, using your own children to ensure your livelihood." Mary, laughing, retorted, You've always been so naive, Jane. You've always been trash. Peter never loved you. Pleasure and passion he learned to feel with me. Jane, containing her anger, replied, You may have been his mistress, but I was his wife. Throughout all these years, I was the one who endured his betrayals, his lies. You used your children to manipulate Peter. Who's the real trash here? Mary, her eyes shining with anger, took a step forward. You think he loved you? He stayed with me because he wanted to, Jane. You're nothing but a shadow in his life. Jane, firm, responded, Maybe I was a shadow, but you'll never have what I have. I have dignity, something you'll never know. And now I'm here to say that it ends today. Mary, furious, shouted, You can't threaten me. I'll take legal action and demand my children's share of your properties. I'll destroy everything you have. Jane, with her eyes fixed on Mary's, replied calmly, Do what you think is best. I'm not afraid of you anymore. I've faced worse things and I'm still standing. Turning away, Jane left Mary's house.